The people who spent the future. Elites, Revolt, and the Short-Term Gods of a Hollow Empire. By Elias Winter, January 3, 2025. Read by an automated voice. Opening. The man with the doctorate and no future. The night I finally saw the word elite clearly, I was sitting at a cheap desk under a soft white lamp, surrounded by evidence that I was supposed to be one. The doctorate hung on the wall behind me in a respectable frame. Shelves of physics and machine learning texts leaned against one another like a small, overeducated fortress. On the screen, a Jupyter notebook plotted neat little causal diagrams of the housing market, arrow after arrow tracing how one thing influences another over time. And next to the keyboard, in the same reach as the trackpad, was the residue of a drug that had almost killed me more than once. On paper, I was the sort of person a country points to when it wants to prove it still believes in merit. Immigrant, doctorate, high-skilled job, a CV written in the dialect of professional success. In practice, I was a man who could write down the math of galaxies and still choose, with full awareness, to trade the next 10 years of his life for one more night of obliteration. If you had looked at me from a distance, the label would have come easily. Educated, successful, one of the elites. If you had looked at my decisions up close, the label that fit was simpler. Someone who had stopped believing in a future. That gap, the distance between what the credential announced and what the decisions revealed, is where this essay lives. Because I would still rather be educated than uneducated. Given the choice between the bookshelf and the empty wall, I would still take the bookshelf. Education did not save me, but ignorance would not have improved the odds. The problem was not the presence of knowledge. The problem was the axis on which I, and the society around me, had learned to measure a life. A country like ours calls someone elite if he collects enough of the visible markers: degrees, titles, income brackets, proximity to certain cities, a facility with the right kinds of language. It treats those things as if they implied something about judgment, about character, about the capacity to act for more than the next quarter, the next cycle, the next hit. It mistakes education for wisdom, wealth for stewardship, and then acts surprised when people with impressive biographies make decisions that hollow out the ground under everyone's feet. From a distance, that miscalculation looks abstract. Up close, it looks like me at that desk. Someone who knows enough math to model risk but will gladly ignore it. Someone who can explain compounding interest and still live as if tomorrow does not exist. Someone whose mind has been trained to think in cosmological time, while his nervous system lives in 30-minute intervals. Addiction is just short-termism made personal. You spend the future, one dose at a time, and trust that the bill will somehow go to a different address. The thing we now call the elites did something similar at national scale. They spent infrastructure, trust, public health, the next generation's stability, in exchange for one more quarter of earnings, one more bump in the poll numbers, one more illusion of growth. Then they hung their degrees on the wall and wondered why the room was filling with a kind of quiet, murderous resentment. We tell ourselves we are living through a revolt against the elites, as if the problem were simply that some people had too much money or too many diplomas. But the anger that has been building in this country is not, at its core, about the existence of competence or even of wealth. It is about something more primitive and more justified, the sense that the people who were trusted with the levers spent the future and then told everyone else to be realistic. The tragedy is not that people finally turned against those who ran the system. The tragedy is that, Instead of learning to distinguish between capacity and wisdom, between knowledge and the way it is used, we grabbed the nearest available categories: educated, expert, coastal, and swung at those. We confused the tool with the hand that holds it. I know what it looks like when a life is misdiagnosed by the wrong axis. For years I was proof that high education can coexist with catastrophic decision-making. The solution to that was not to remove the doctorate from the wall. It was to reintroduce the idea of a future into the room. The same is true of a country. The question is not whether it has elites. The question is what time horizon governs the people who happen to be sitting in the chairs. This is not an essay against education or against wealth. It is an indictment of something colder and less visible. The class of people, in every system and ideology, who have learned to treat the future as someone else's problem. And the revolts that keep mistaking their resume for their crime. Chapter 1. The word we turned into a weapon. The word elite does not arrive in your mind as a definition. It arrives as a face. For some people, it's a New York anchor in a narrow suit, speaking in that smooth, mid-Atlantic dialect that sounds like it was ironed. For others, it's a private equity man in a fleece vest, walking through an airport he never really has to live in. For others still, it's a young woman with a graduate degree and a Twitter account, using unfamiliar words to explain why their town deserved to lose its factory. By the time the dictionary shows up, the verdict is already in. If you go looking for the official meaning, it is almost disappointingly dry. A small group. Disproportionate influence. Superior in some respect. Wealth, education, power, training. There is nothing mystical there. An elite is simply a fraction of the population that stands on higher ground than the rest, whether that height was earned, inherited, stolen, or granted by accident. Notice what is missing. The definition does not say deserving. It does not say wise, honorable, or fit to rule. It does not even say competent. The word is observational, not moral. It tells you where someone is standing, not whether they should be there. In other words, elite is a map coordinate. We have turned it into a diagnosis. Part of the problem is that the word now has to carry too much. In a country that no longer agrees on basic reality, elite has become the stand-in for whatever upstream power people can still vaguely sense but no longer clearly see. So it gets loaded up. Money, education, media, bureaucracy, technology, urban life, coastal accents, certain brands of suitcase. The more we lose the ability to describe the machinery, the more pressure we put on this one syllable to explain why our lives feel smaller than advertised. If you pull the word apart instead of swinging it, you find at least 4 different axes hiding inside the same insult. The first is the most obvious: wealth. The people who own things. Not just a nice car or a house bought with 30 years of wages, but the kind of ownership that generates more ownership all by itself. Equity, capital, rental streams, the subtle machinery of debt. Wealth elite is the couple in Connecticut whose investment returns in a sleepy year outweigh a nurse's lifetime of night shifts. It is the family office you never hear about, quietly buying half a city block. The second is education and credentials. Degrees, certifications, the right letters after a name. This kind of elite is made, not born. It moves through admissions offices, qualifying exams, internships, foundation grants. It is the adjunct professor with 2 PhDs and no savings. It is the software engineer who can't afford to buy a home in the city where his company is headquartered. It is also the surgeon, the appellate lawyer, the policy analyst writing regulations he would never be able to explain at a kitchen table after a 12-hour shift. The third is institutional power, the people who sign off. cabinet secretaries, central bankers, agency heads, general counsels, executives, senior staffers, the men and women whose names the average citizen does not know, but whose choices determine what gets built, what gets closed, what gets funded, who gets arrested, and whose problems count as systemic. The fourth is cultural authority. The ones who decide which words are allowed in public without consequences. Editors, showrunners, tenured theorists, the more agile brand of pastor, the influencers who discover that if they talk the right way about the right things at the right time, the algorithm will forgive almost anything else. Sometimes these categories overlap in a single person. More often, they do not. The wealthy landlord with 300 units may have no degree. The broke schoolteacher with a master's in literature has cultural capital in one narrow circle, and almost no leverage anywhere else. The deputy undersecretary at a federal agency may have enormous power over strangers' lives and very little over his own calendar. The NGO worker with the correct vocabulary and a negative net worth is called elite on television, while the private equity partner behind the studio is called a job creator. Our language does not track any of this. We pour it all into one undifferentiated bucket marked elites, and then wonder why every argument about them feels slightly insane. A man who inherits a shipping empire and spends his days moving zeros around on screens is an elite in a very different sense from a woman who teaches at an Ivy League university while worrying about how to pay her rent. A White House staffer drafting foreign policy talking points and a YouTube political commentator with 3 million followers both live under the word elite. But the distance between their actual power and their daily vulnerability is not measured in inches. It is measured in entire categories of risk. When people say they are angry at the elites, they are rarely making these distinctions consciously. They are not running a four-dimensional typology in the back of their minds. They are registering something more basic. There is a class of people whose decisions shape my life, and I did not consent to their values or their priorities. They feel a gap between what was promised and what was delivered, and they reach for the language that still seems allowed. The trouble begins when the word is asked to do more than it can do. Instead of being used to describe where power sits, it is used to condemn a certain kind of person, as if wealth, education, status, and fluency were all symptoms of the same spiritual disease. You can hear the slippage in ordinary conversation. Elite stops being a positional adjective and becomes a personality type. It becomes shorthand for out of touch, arrogant, doesn't care about people like me. It becomes a moral category. That shift is not accidental. It is encouraged. It is useful for certain people if anger at ownership can be redirected into contempt for education, if disgust at short-term extraction can be deflected into resentment of accent and vocabulary. It is safer for the system if a nurse in Ohio decides that the person ruining her life is the grad student who corrected her on Twitter, rather than the board that closed her rural hospital, because the numbers looked better without it. So the word becomes a weapon, but a blunt one, swung sideways, often in the wrong direction. The cost of this imprecision is not only rhetorical, it is political and spiritual. Once you have trained yourself to see elite whenever you see a degree, a coastal city, a certain set of clothes, you start to blur the line between capacity and abuse of capacity. You start to forget that an engineer who understands how the bridge is built is not your enemy. The enemy is the man who decided to save money on maintenance, so the quarter would look clean. You also begin to erase the people who are truly elite in ways that matter but do not show. The landlord who will never appear on television. The donor whose name is on the building, but whose lawyers make sure he is never the one subpoenaed. The senior official who can crash a foreign currency with a sentence, and then go home and sleep. When elite becomes just another way of saying, person who annoys me from a distance, you lose the ability to track where actual power lives. More quietly, you also lose the ability to articulate a basic human truth, that it is better to understand the systems you are trapped in than to stumble through them blind, that knowing how interest works, or how legislation is written, or how climate models are built, does not make you part of some foreign class. It gives you a marginally better chance of surviving the century you were born into. I am not interested in sanitizing the word. The people we put under that label have, in many cases, earned the anger they are now facing. They presided over the offshoring, the layoffs, the creeping despair that settles over a town when the last thing of value is a prison and a Walmart. They designed the financial products that turned homes into chips on a table. They sterilized language itself until ordinary people could no longer recognize their own stories in the news. They deserve to be named. But if we are going to name them, we have to know what we are pointing at. Are we angry at wealth without responsibility? At education without wisdom? At power without accountability? At cultural authority without any corresponding willingness to tell the truth when it costs something? Those are different indictments, even when they end up written on the same protest sign. The dictionary tells you only that an elite is a small group with more influence than the rest. It does not tell you why they have it, how they use it, or whether their existence is a problem. Those questions require another axis altogether, one the word does not currently contain. An axis that has less to do with how many degrees someone has, or how many houses they own, and more to do with what they are willing to spend in order to keep their position, their own comfort, their own safety, their own illusions, or everyone else's future. For now, it is enough to say this: elite is not a moral verdict. It is a description of height. Before we decide whom to drag from the hill, we might want to ask which heights are dangerous, which are necessary, and which are occupied by people we cannot see because we have been trained to stare at the wrong silhouettes. Chapter 2. The Two Elites and the Wrong Axis. If you listen carefully when people spit the word elite, you can hear two different ghosts rattling around inside the same syllable. One is money, the other is school. On one side, there is the person who owns the building. On the other, the person who taught in it for 30 years and left with a plaque, a box of books, and not much else. In our current vocabulary, both can be folded into the elites: the landlord because he extracts the rent, the teacher because she has a master's degree and says structural in the wrong company. The first difference we have to name, before anything else can be said honestly, is that wealth and education do not occupy the same universe of possibility. Wealth, in the way that matters here, is not simply having some money. It is owning things that work for you while you sleep. It is equity, land, businesses, instruments, claims on other people's time. It is positions in a system of compounding returns. You cannot wake up tomorrow and decide to be in that class. You can try, you can hustle, you can gamble, you can build, but there is no switch you can throw that moves you from the world of wages to the world of capital. Education, real education, not just the decorative kind, is different. It is a capacity, not an asset. It is a set of tools, lenses, habits of thought. It is knowing how to parse a contract, how to read a balance sheet, how to follow a chain of causality in a system that was designed to keep you dizzy. You cannot wake up tomorrow and be educated, but you can wake up tomorrow and begin. That difference matters. It matters because it means that whatever else we say about the sins of the credentialed class, and there are many, education remains an axis you can move on by choice and effort in a way that inherited ownership never will. It is not free. It is not equally accessible. It is not frictionless for someone working 2 jobs and raising children in a town whose library closed 10 years ago. But it is permeable in a way that the top of the wealth pyramid is not. A system that trains you to hate education is a system that has decided you should never touch the only ladder it still technically allows you. Here, I have to make this personal again, not because my life is uniquely instructive, but because it is a clean, contained version of the same miscalculation. On paper, I was the triumph of that ladder. Doctorate in physics, published research, a career in data science. My life was what you get when a poor kid believes the story that education is the legitimate path into the protected class. It gave me access to rooms my parents could not have entered in any other way. It gave me a language, a passport, a salary that could absorb a few bad months without immediate catastrophe. It did not, by itself, give me the ability to make a single wise decision about my own life. For years, I lived with a brain trained to think about the long arc of galaxies, while my body organized itself around the next 12 hours. I understood, in a technical sense, how compounding interest worked. I behaved as if nothing in my life would ever compound except regret. I could model risk for a living, and then, on the same day, quietly offer up the next decade of my cardiovascular system to a crystalline substance that did not care how many letters came after my name. If you had graphed my decisions and my diplomas on 2 separate axes, the lines would not have touched. This is the part of the story that people who worship education do not like to talk about. It is also the part that people who despise the educated do not understand. Education gave me leverage, not direction. It expanded the range of moves I could make without telling me which ones would destroy me. It made recovery possible later. It did nothing to prevent collapse when my time horizon shrank to the width of a night. When you live like that long enough, you begin to see every evaluation of your life that uses educated as a synonym for doing well as dark comedy. I could walk into a corporate office in the morning and be treated as a high-value asset because of the doctorate, the technical skill, the way I could make numbers behave in executive slides. I could walk into my apartment at night and watch myself choose, with full awareness, to annihilate the next day's clarity, the next week's health, the next year's chance of not dying before my parents. The axis the world used to classify me, highly educated, was not false. It was simply irrelevant to the question that mattered most. Could this person be trusted with a future? That is the real distinction we keep refusing to make when we talk about elites. We treat education as if it implied wisdom. It doesn't. It implies exposure to information, training in some subset of skills, maybe a certain endurance for delayed gratification early in life. None of that guarantees the capacity to act in a way that preserves anything beyond the next small hit of relief, the next promotion, the next headline, the next dopamine spike, the next soft landing on the other side of a crisis we manufactured ourselves. We treat wealth as if it implied stewardship. It doesn't. It implies that, at some point, voluntarily or not, the system bent around a person in such a way that more resources began flowing to them than they needed to stay alive. What they do with that position is a separate question. The key variable that cuts through both is something we almost never name, because it sounds old and moral and unfashionable. The time horizon of a decision. When I was using, my time horizon was measured in hours. How do I feel now? How do I get through tonight? The future was an abstraction, a story someone else would live in. From that vantage point, many catastrophic moves became rational. Of course, you spend rent money on the thing that prevents you from wanting to die today. Of course, You blow up relationships that threaten to pull you out of the pattern your nervous system has mistaken for safety. Of course, you risk your job, your health, your immigration status, your entire biography. The currency you are trading in is not years. It is minutes without pain. Addiction is an accelerated, visible form of something this country has been doing at a slower, more respectable tempo for decades. Boards approving buybacks instead of maintenance, hours, politicians choosing poll-tested cruelty over boring repair, cycles, tech executives optimizing products to keep children on screens a little longer because that is what the quarterly metrics will reward. Minutes. Each decision, in isolation, can be justified. Together they form a pattern, an entire class of people whose nervous systems have been trained to discount the future into non-existence. In that sense, the difference between a man with a doctorate trading his heart for a high and a CEO trading a town's stability for a Q4 bump is not as large as either side would prefer to think. The stakes differ. The scale differs. The time horizons do not. This is why I do not join the chorus that says education is a scam, nor the opposing choir that speaks of the educated class as if it were a priesthood. Education is a set of tools. Wisdom is the choice of what to build with them, and for whom, and for how long. If you ask me whether I would choose to live that same decade of my life without the education, the answer is an easy no. Being educated did not stop me from wrecking myself, but it made it possible later to analyze what had happened, to reconstitute a self, to understand the system I had been part of, and the incentives I had obeyed. Ignorance would not have granted me a more virtuous collapse. It would have left me less able to name it. The same is true at the level of a nation. You can have a population with advanced degrees and still steer the country into a ditch. You can also have a population that has been trained to distrust every form of education. And the ditch will simply arrive faster, with fewer people able to read the warning signs on the side of the road. The question that matters is not, are we ruled by the educated or the uneducated? It is, what time horizon governs the people whose decisions the rest of us cannot easily escape? A wealthy person who thinks in 30-year increments, who is willing to pay taxes now so that children he will never meet can drink water that does not poison them, is less dangerous than a broke official whose only concern is how the numbers will look before the next election. A professor who spends her life teaching people how to see through propaganda is less of a threat than the man who has never read a book but knows exactly how to keep a factory just compliant enough to avoid lawsuits while its workers die 10 years early of preventable diseases. We keep evaluating people on the wrong axis because the wrong axis is legible. Degrees can be counted. Net worth can be ranked. Titles can be printed on badges. Time horizon cannot be measured at a glance. It reveals itself only over months, years, decades. By the time you know for sure whether someone was a steward or a vandal, the damage, or the inheritance, is already baked in. So we fall back on what we can see. We call the educated elite and attribute to them a level of power that many do not actually have. We call the wealthy successful and refuse to examine what exactly has succeeded. We point to our own diplomas or salaries as proof that we are doing well, as if it were impossible to be both admired and suicidal, both solvent and destroying the possibility of any life beyond our own. The lesson I take from that desk under the soft white lamp is not that education is meaningless. It is that education, wealth, and status are the wrong metrics to use when we are trying to understand why people revolt, why they obey, why they feel betrayed. The metric that explains more of my life, of this country, of the revolutions that keep burning through history, is simpler and more humiliating. It is this: To what extent are the people in charge willing to harm their own short-term comfort to protect a future they will not personally enjoy? Everything else is decoration. Chapter 3. Revolutions that aimed at faces, not vectors. If my own life is a small, private example of what happens when you measure the wrong thing, revolutions are the public version. They are what it looks like when a society decides that the axis it has been using to judge its leaders is intolerable, and then, more often than not, chooses the wrong replacement. We like to imagine revolutions as clean moral stories. The people rise, the tyrants fall, the flags change, history takes a breath. What actually happens, most of the time, is messier and more disappointing. A set of faces is removed from the stage. The script about time stays the same. Take the French Revolution, our favorite myth of righteous decapitation. On the surface, it was exactly what people now mean when they talk about backlash against the elites. A starving population watched a court spend money it didn't have on wars and sugar, dresses and illusions. A tiny class of aristocrats and clergy insulated themselves from risk, taxes, and consequence, while everyone else paid in coin and bone. If you were a peasant in 1788, you did not need a theory of global capital to understand that the people above you were spending your future for their present. The first moves made sense. Attack legal privilege, attack feudal dues, attack a wealth elite that had confused its own comfort with the natural order of the universe. The target was clear: the people who sat on inherited height and had stopped believing that anyone below them was real. Then the time horizon collapsed. Once the machinery of revolt was in motion, the question stopped being, how do we build a country that will still be standing in 50 years? And became, how do we make it through this week without losing our heads? Moderates became traitors. Former allies became enemies. The guillotine, which had been aimed at a very specific structure of wealth and privilege, began slicing its way through anyone whose caution sounded too much like patience. Knowledge did not become the axis of reconstruction. It became a liability. Engineers, administrators, people who understood how to keep grain moving and bridges standing found themselves under suspicion because competence looked too much like complicity. The revolution, which had started as an indictment of a class that had spent the future, began burning through the very capacity it would have needed to build a different one. The monarchy fell. The logic of immediacy did not. In the end, it took a new kind of elite, Napoleon's bureaucratic and military apparatus, to stabilize the wreckage. Different faces, same basic contract. Sacrifice the future for glory now, for security now, for order now. Russia followed a similar script, with different costumes. In 1917, it was not irrational for a factory worker or a conscript to hate the people running the empire. A tiny, insulated class of nobles and capitalists supervised poverty, war, and humiliation from a safe distance. Breadlines and mass graves are a persuasive argument. When the Bolsheviks promised to end the rule of the elites, landlords, factory owners, ministers who never saw the front, it sounded like a correction. Again, the first impulse was not entirely wrong. Attack ownership structures that turned human lives into collateral. Attack a political order that treated peasants as expendable fertilizer. Attack the idea that birth gave anyone the right to oversee other people's starvation. But once the old ruling class was removed, the target list expanded. Education and expertise, especially when they did not kneel to the new doctrine, began to look like contamination. Engineers, agronomists, managers, anyone who might say, "This is not going to work. The numbers don't add up. The soil won't bear this. became suspicious, not because they were elites in the sense of wealth, but because they represented a form of authority that did not depend on the party. The vector that needed to change was simple: decisions being made on the basis of ideology and personal security in the next month, rather than the viability of millions of lives over the next decade. Instead, the revolution aimed at faces: the bourgeois, the specialists, the people whose education made them inconvenient. Famine and terror followed, administered by a new elite that was every bit as short-term in its survival instincts as the one it had overthrown. China, a few decades later, repeated the pattern with more bodies and better slogans. The early communist movement had a legitimate case against the landowners and compradors who treated peasants as extractive surfaces. Land reform, redistribution, the promise of dignity to people whose lives had been cheap. These were not illusions. They were overdue corrections. But once the party had the state, and once Mao decided that permanent revolution was the only way to keep his own position safe, the target shifted from the people who owned the country to the people who knew how to run it. During the Cultural Revolution, it was not the secret millionaires who were dragged into stadiums and humiliated. It was teachers, professors, doctors, anyone whose knowledge predated the current script. The young were turned into Red Guards and encouraged to treat learning itself as a form of treason. The result was what you would expect when a society chooses faces over vectors. Bridges cracked, harvests failed, and the very capacity to imagine a long-term national project was smashed in a frenzy that felt, in the moment, like justice. Iran's revolution was driven as much by humiliation as by hunger. But the mechanism was familiar. A Western-backed monarch presided over rapid modernization, conspicuous wealth, and brutal security services. Oil money flowed upward. Tradition was treated as something to be managed, staged, or erased. If you lived on the wrong end of that arrangement, your anger did not need permission. The Shah and his circle behaved exactly like an elite that had stopped believing the people below them were anything more than scenery. When the revolution came, it aimed at exactly those people: the royal family, the technocrats, the wealthy urban class. But it also aimed at what they looked like: clothes, language, habits, books. Western suits and miniskirts became symbols of treason. The revolt did not distinguish between the kind of technocratic expertise that could build infrastructure and the kind of imported decadence that had turned the country into someone else's showcase. Both were thrown into the same fire. The result was not a society freed from elites. It was a society handed over to a new one, clerical, ideological, as concerned with its own immediate survival as any court. The state's time horizon did not lengthen. It simply attached itself to a different set of myths. You can keep walking through history like this. Post-colonial states that expelled colonial administrators only to replace them with local strongmen, whose main skill was staying alive until next Tuesday. Latin American populist movements that chased oligarchs and foreign companies while continuing to fund their promises with whatever resource could be stripped and sold fastest. African liberation leaders who inherited borders, debts, and extractive economies, and then, instead of re-architecting time, learned to surf the same waves for a shorter ride. In almost every case, you can see the same pattern if you look past the flags. First, there is the initial recognition. The people above us have spent the future and handed us the bill. Sometimes the bill is literal: debt, inflation, a cratered currency. Sometimes it is physical: infrastructure that collapses, soil that no longer grows, water that poisons. Sometimes it is moral: police who no longer bother to pretend, courts that sell verdicts, elections that are counted but not believed. Then comes the revolt, or at least the appetite for one. At that moment, There is a narrow window in which a society can decide what, precisely, it wants to overthrow. It can aim at ownership, who controls land, capital, and the rules that govern them. It can aim at incentives, what kinds of decisions are rewarded, what time horizons are normalized. Or it can aim at symbols, faces, accents, clothes, visible forms of education, the nearest available proxy for all the invisible machinery. Most of the time, it chooses the third. It is easier to drag a man from his office than to redesign the system that made his kind inevitable. It is easier to burn books than to build institutions in which reading will not always be held hostage by whoever pays for the building. It is easier to humiliate a professor in a town square than to devise a way of training future engineers who will not be captured by the next regime's fantasies. Faces are immediate. Vectors are not. You can put a face on the cover of a pamphlet and call it victory. You cannot put a change in collective time preference on a billboard. This is not an argument against revolt. There are moments when nothing else will do. A political order that has become fully committed to spending other people's lives for its own comfort is not going to be gently persuaded into stewardship by a white paper and a town hall meeting. But if you look at the revolutions that left something worth living in, and there are a few, they share one unfashionable trait. They managed, somehow, to preserve or rebuild capacity while they were tearing down privilege. They did not declare war on expertise simply because the last regime had employed some clever men. They did not treat education as contamination. They aimed, to the extent they could, at the vector. The way decisions were made, the kinds of incentives that governed them, the time horizons that were considered acceptable for policies that would outlive their authors. Most revolutions, including the ones we like to romanticize, did not do this. They changed who sat in the chairs. They did not change what the chairs were for. The point of tracing this pattern is not to deliver a history lecture. It is to clear enough conceptual space to see what is happening now, in our own allegedly enlightened corner of the empire, without flattering ourselves. Because when you strip away the costumes, the anger moving through America is not fundamentally different from the anger that moved through Paris, Petrograd, Beijing, Tehran. The people at the bottom of the hill are again watching the people at the top spend a future they will never live in. And once again, the language available to describe that fact is being bent in real time to make sure that when the shouting starts, it hits everything except the underlying decision rule. Chapter 4. America's Revolt Against the Wrong People. If you want to know what American anti-elitism feels like from the inside, don't start with a think tank essay. Start in a parking lot. Picture a man on his lunch break, sitting in a car that is technically his, but mostly belongs to the bank. He works in a warehouse that used to be a factory. Before that, it was a field. He is listening to a voice on the radio that sounds like him if he had been born with better teeth and slightly less fear. The voice is talking about the elites. They are, apparently, everywhere. In the cities, in the schools, in the news. They drink coffee wrong and laugh at the wrong jokes. They don't go to church. They use words that don't show up on the menu at Applebee's. They are running the country into the ground. Change the channel. Change the costume. Now it's a podcast recorded in Brooklyn, an earnest voice talking about the educated class and dangerous populism. The villains this time are less colorful, but equally vague. Reactionary voters, anti-vaxxers, people who lack media literacy. They are also everywhere. They shop at the wrong stores, believe the wrong things, vote for the wrong men, raise the wrong questions on Facebook. In both stories, the problem is the same. The other side has the wrong kind of people in charge. From inside my own life, it was not hard to see why the warehouse worker might think I was the problem. I lived in a city that treated his town as a punchline. I worked in an industry that turned his attention into data and sold it back to him as addiction. I spoke the language of the diploma class, and the people who paid me did, in fact, sign contracts with other people who were slowly stripping his world for parts. From a certain angle, the line between me and the men who made those decisions was thin enough to blur. But what that man could not see from his car, and what most of the people talking about him from studios have no interest in showing him, is that my own life was not being steered by any of the caricatures he had been given. It was being steered by the same quiet God that runs everything else here. The demand that whatever matters must pay off soon. The company that employed me did not care that I had a doctorate. It cared that the graphs I produced could be tied to quarterly revenue. The executives who signed my performance reviews did not care whether my work improved the life of anyone outside a small circle of shareholders. They cared if we could show lift in the metrics that would go into a slide deck before the next board meeting. The fact that I was educated was, in that context, a tool, not a conspiracy. It made it easier for me to serve a horizon measured in weeks. The anger that has been building in this country is not, at its core, about the existence of people like me. It is about the fact that the people who were supposed to think in decades have been thinking in quarters, and the bill for that has come due in the form of fentanyl, rust, and a generation that expects to be poorer than their parents. You do not need a political science degree to recognize that as betrayal. You need only to watch a bridge decay while the market sets a record, or to work at a hospital that closes its maternity ward while the CEO gets a retention bonus. The tragedy is that by the time that recognition surfaced, the vocabulary available to describe it had already been sabotaged. Instead of learning to say, "I am angry at the people who own the places where I work and live, who keep choosing short-term profit over long-term stability," the warehouse worker was given a different sentence, "I am angry at the elites." Instead of learning to distinguish between the billionaire who funds both parties and the nurse practitioner who went into debt to learn how to keep his children alive, he was encouraged to treat "went to college" as a single suspicious category. Instead of being handed a map of ownership, he was handed a mood board of mannerisms. The same was happening upstream. The credentialed class, especially in media and academia, learned to talk about white resentment, authoritarian personality structures, and low-information voters, instead of looking at the plain fact that many of the people now voting for their enemies had once believed the same story about education and work that I did, and had watched it collapse in front of them. It is easier, if you live in a city and make your living with words, to believe that the hazard is too much ignorance than to admit that people with your degrees and your friends and your institutions helped design an economy that treats most lives as expendable. So the country split along a stupid line. On one side, contempt flowed downward. If only these people understood how the system worked, they would not be so angry. On the other, contempt flowed upward. If only these people had to live with the consequences of their own decisions, they would lose their smugness. Both versions are emotionally satisfying. Neither comes close to naming the vector that actually matters: the shared, bipartisan, cross-class decision to make the future someone else's problem. You can see the misfire most clearly in the way this country has begun to treat education itself. There are now entire media ecosystems devoted to the idea that the educated are the enemy. Not because they hold power, most do not, but because their existence is a convenient surface on which to project the rage that would be too costly to aim at their employers. Teachers, epidemiologists, mid-level civil servants, local journalists, people who understand just enough of the machinery to be dangerous to lies, have been rebranded as the elites and made into legitimate targets. At the same time, the very people encouraging that hatred send their children to the best schools they can afford, hire lawyers who can interpret the law's fine print, retain consultants who speak the dialect of policy. They do not disdain education in practice. They disdain the idea that anyone else might use it to defend themselves. The result is a kind of engineered autoimmunity. The part of the social body that still produces antibodies, skepticism, literacy, technical competence, is reclassified as infection, and the fevered parts of the country are encouraged to attack it. This would be suicidal in any era. In ours, it is almost cosmically perverse. Because just as the country decided that knowing things was suspect, the tools that could have made knowledge radically more accessible arrived. A tired nurse in a small town no longer has to enroll in an expensive program to learn statistics or law or history. She can pull the world's libraries into her phone. A teenager whose parents have nothing in the bank can, in theory, access the same lectures and models as the children of the donors whose names are on the buildings. For the first time in the life of the species, the bottleneck on education is less about scarcity of information than about the willingness to sit still long enough to metabolize it. If we were serious about freedom, we would treat that as a miracle. We would be flooding the zone with patient explanations, with tools, with systems that make it easier for working people to understand the contracts they sign, the algorithms that govern them, the laws that quietly redraw the borders of their lives. Instead, we are teaching them that the very act of trying to understand these systems is a betrayal of their class, a surrender to elite narratives, a kind of treason against their own resentments. That is not an accident. It is cheaper to govern a population that has been taught to distrust every source of knowledge, except the ones that turn its pain into ratings. At the same time, the people who actually own things, the funds, the firms, the families, have perfected a kind of respectable short-termism that can no longer be pinned to a single party or ideology. They will happily fund conservative outrages one cycle and liberal ones the next, as long as nothing interferes with the quarterly numbers. They will talk about sustainability while strip mining whatever can still be monetized. They will donate to universities and think tanks that produce the language in which their own behavior becomes invisible. These are the elites a sane revolt would aim at. Not because they are rich, but because they have proven, over and over, that they are willing to trade long-term public capacity for short-term private comfort, and because they have the leverage to do it in ways that an angry man in a truck never will. The real axis is not educated versus uneducated, urban versus rural, red versus blue. It is those whose decisions are structurally bound to the next few reporting periods versus those who will live in the world those decisions produce. Most Americans are in the second group. Most of the people the radio tells them to hate are in the second group. Most of the people who quietly decide whether their town will exist in 20 years are in the first. We are living, in other words, through the earliest stages of a revolt that has been carefully misdirected. The anger is legitimate. The aim is off by just enough to be harmless to the people who deserve it most. Instead of asking, who spent the future, we are asking, who talks like the people who spent the future? Instead of demanding to know why infrastructure fails and hospitals close and housing eats half a paycheck, we are busy fighting over who gets to be called elite in a tone of voice that makes it sound like a character flaw. And beneath that noise, the machine continues. Bonuses paid, companies flipped, laws quietly rewritten so that the next crisis will fall a little harder on the same backs. I do not blame the man in the parking lot for his anger. If I had lived his life, I would be angrier than he is. I do blame the people who have spent billions of dollars teaching him that his enemy is the nurse who told him the vaccine was safe, the teacher who tried to show his children how to read propaganda, the young journalist who mispronounced the name of his town but was trying, in her clumsy way, to tell the truth about what had been done to it. Those people are not his enemies. They are the last thin line between his children and a future in which every choice that affects their lives is made in a boardroom whose windows do not open. When a country trains itself to see elite whenever it sees a degree, it is halfway to giving up the only nonviolent tools it has left. When it trains itself to see just folks whenever it sees a billionaire who says the right things on television, it has already surrendered. What is rising in America is not simply a revolt against elites. It is, at a deeper level, a revolt against the feeling of being trapped in someone else's time horizon. People are correct to hate that. They are correct to feel used. They are correct to suspect that the people making decisions about their lives will not be around when the consequences arrive. They are wrong about who, exactly, has been spending the future. And unless that part changes, unless we learn, somehow, to distinguish between those who still believe in a common tomorrow and those who treat tomorrow as scrap value, all of our talk about anti-elite backlash will be just another way of saying that we aimed at the nearest face and left the vector untouched. Conclusion. When I think about elites now, I don't picture a particular face. I picture a gesture, a hand reaching forward to take something that does not belong to it yet, a pension, a river, a child's attention span, an aquifer that will not refill in our lifetime, an atmosphere that will not clear in theirs. The gesture is always the same. Take the long-term thing, turn it into a short-term gain. Trust that the cost will be paid by people who don't have your phone number. The people who do this come in every costume. Some of them are exactly who you would expect: CEOs, financiers, political consultants, men who talk about runway and tailwinds and regrettable but necessary restructuring. Others do their work in quieter ways: mid-level officials who learn to stop asking questions, administrators who understand the numbers but not the stakes, educated professionals who rent out their competence to whatever project will keep their children in the right district. You could call all of them elites if you want. The word is not wrong. It is just too small for the damage. In my own life, the person who spent the future most ruthlessly was not a billionaire or a politician. It was me, alone, choosing over and over again to trade 10 years of possible life for one more spiral down. No board compelled me. No party whipped the vote. I had all the education a country can offer someone like me. What I lacked was not information. It was any felt obligation to the person I would be in 5 years, or to the people who loved him. The fact that I would still rather be educated than not does not cancel that truth. It sharpens it. It means that education is not enough to save a life that has quietly stopped believing in a future. It means that a nation full of degrees can still decide, one budget at a time, to cannibalize its own children. We talk about anti-elite revolts as if they were arguments about class, about who deserves to sit where on the pyramid. But underneath the slogans and the flags and the names, most of them come down to a simpler question: who will be allowed to spend the future, and on what terms, and for whose benefit? The answer, so far, has been depressingly consistent. We let those decisions be made by whoever happens to be closest to the levers when the music stops. We let them use education as a shield and wealth as a cushion. We judge them by their resumes, their credentials, their aesthetics, their stated values, by everything except the one metric that might tell us whether they are safe to trust. How far into time are they willing to see? And whom do they include in that distance? It is possible to imagine elites who are hated less because they have chosen, stubbornly, to lengthen that horizon. People who treat their position not as a lottery win, but as a custodial role. People who are willing to endure a little less comfort now so that strangers can drink water, cross bridges, and walk into hospitals that still exist in 30 years. People who understand that a country is not a quarter, and a civilization is not an election cycle. We do not have many of those people in charge. We have, instead, a class of short-term specialists, some rich, some merely professional, almost all of them so marinated in immediacy that they no longer notice the smell. The backlash against them was inevitable. Any population that watches its future being liquidated will eventually begin to kick. The question was never whether America would revolt. The question was whether it would learn, before the kicking started, to tell the difference between a person who understands the machinery and a person who owns the switch. So far, the answer has been no. We have turned elite into a curse word and started throwing it at anyone whose vocabulary or address makes us uncomfortable. We have confused the scaffolding with the wrecking crew. We have taught ourselves, with great passion, to mistrust the very tools we would need if we ever decided to do more than change the faces at the top of the hill. I do not know if that can be undone. I am not optimistic by habit. An empire that has learned to monetize its own decay does not usually decide, halfway through, to become wise. But I do know what it took, at a much smaller scale, for one person to stop spending the future as if no one else lived there. It did not require an entirely new self. It required a different kind of shame. Not the shame of having failed to meet the metrics the world admired, money, status, performance, but the shame of looking at the people who loved me and admitting that I had been treating their future, and mine, as scrap. Once that landed, education became useful again. The same tools that had once served my collapse could be turned quietly toward repair. A sane politics would aim for something similar at the level of a country. Not a purge of the educated or the rich, but a withdrawal of permission from anyone at any income or credential level who has shown a consistent willingness to spend what they cannot restore. The question is not whether we will have elites. Every complex society does. The question is whether we will keep accepting a definition that stops at height and ignores time. Who has been living as if the future is real? Who has been acting as if it is already collateral? Who thinks about children whose names they do not know when they vote, build, invest, design? Who has made a habit of harvesting what only grows once? Organize your anger around those questions, and the word elite will begin to mean something again. Aim it at faces, and the people who spent the future will go on spending, quietly, while we tear each other apart over the right to be called ordinary. At the end of that night at the desk, I cleared the surface. Books, laptop, residue. I didn't become wise. I just became temporarily unwilling to keep living as if there was no later. It was a minor adjustment in cosmic terms. It felt, at the time, like treason against the version of me that only knew how to live in the next few hours. In the years since, I have met many men and women whose names you do not know who carry themselves with the same small refusal. They are not saints. They are not martyrs. They are just people who have decided that their comfort now is not worth their children's fear later. Some of them have money. Some of them have degrees. Most of them will never be called elites. If there is any hope left for this place, it is with them, not with the people who paid for the slogans or the ones who shout them on the radio. They are the only kind of elite I am willing to defend. The ones who still behave as if they will be held accountable by someone who has not been born yet. Everyone else, however educated or successful, however relatable or authentic, belongs in the same simple category. They are the people who spent the future. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.